the introduction could take a large part of the meeting, actually, in terms of Nan and her contributions to the Labour movement. If I were to describe Nan, she's probably one of the wisest women I know. For those of you who don't know Nan, she is a writer, and she'll be talking about one of her books this evening. She is Labour Women's Network's lead trainer and has been supporting lots of women across the Labour movement for many years, occupy positions within the party at every level. If there's anything I missed from that introduction, I'm sure Nan will be more than welcome to explain her contribution to the Labour movement. So how the event is going to work is that we're going to hear from Nan. She's going to read a passage from her book, The Women in the Room, and we will then enter a discussion, at which point I will welcome questions from those of you here this evening. So over to you, Nan.
Thank you very much, Kiran, and thank you all very much for coming to this. It's a pleasure to see so many people who are interested in the women in the room at the beginning of our movement. I'm going to read a fairly short passage from the book to give us a sort of something to think about and a frame for questions and discussions later. The bit that I have chosen is about the foundation of an organisation called the Women's Labour League, which was the first Labour Party women's organisation set up in 1906, and then was the only women's organisation affiliated to the Labour Party, as LWN is the only women's organisation affiliated to the Labour Party now. So I thought there was a nice little bit of symmetry there. There are a couple of things that I need to say as scene setting, as it were. The first is that in 1906, the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, which we think of as the militant suffragette organisation, was in fact the women's wing of the independent Labour Party, the ILP, which had been founded in 1894 and was itself one of the first affiliates to the Labour Party, was a founding organisation of the Labour Party. And the WSPU was founded by women members of the ILP. Secondly, the Labour Party, when it was founded, was not called the Labour Party, it was called the Labour Representation Committee. It became the Labour Party in 1906, after the general election, when there was a Liberal landslide, the last time that ever happened, when the Conservative government lost half of its seats, hopefully not the last time that will ever happen, and the Labour Party got its first substantial number of MPs, of 29 Labour MPs. So it's in that context. And finally, a woman called Mary Fenton Mcpherson had been trying to set a women's organisation up before the election, and we picked the story up after the election. So hopefully that won't leave you spending too much time thinking, I don't understand what she's on about. So I'm just going to read this passage, and then, as Kiran says, we'll move on to discussion and questions. Women were active throughout the 1906 campaign. The Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, was still, at least nominally, an organisation of Labour women. And although Christabel Pankhurst had already begun to view the Labour Representation Committee as an enemy, her mother Emmeline continued to regard many Labour people as friends and allies, spending much of the election helping Keir Hardie in Merthyr Tydfil. Other WSPU members enjoyed themselves energetically disrupting the campaigns of various Liberal candidates and in particular working against Winston Churchill in Manchester. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, on the other hand, had a policy of supporting any candidate, regardless of party, who supported women's suffrage. Meanwhile, Mary Fenton Mcpherson had continued to pursue the question of setting up a separate but connected Labour women's organisation. The creation of the Women's Labour League is sometimes explained as Ramsay MacDonald's idea for something which would give his wife Margaret and other Labour wives something to do. However, it is rare for men to put energy into creating women's organisations, though they may, and often do, seek to control or take them over once they exist. And in any case, Margaret was not at all the sort of woman to add yet another layer of activity to her already busy life, unless she believed in it. But there are a number of other reasons why she should have chosen to take it on. It must already have been clear by 1906 that the WSPU was not going to be able to serve as a Labour women's organisation for much longer. Some trade union women, like Mary MacArthur and Mary Mcpherson, also had a number of concerns about the activities of Eva Gorbooth and Esther Roper in Lancashire and Cheshire, and Sylvia Pankhurst in the East End of London. They thought that a working class movement so heavily focused on suffrage as the solution to women's problems would distract from the question of working women's economic oppression. Both before and during the election, there was discussion in a number of quarters about what to do next, including, according to a later account, a long consultation with Mrs. MacDonald, after which the Executive Committee of the Railway Women's Guild called a preliminary meeting of women. Margaret MacDonald's contribution was important not just because of her husband. She was a powerful and influential personality who focused on action rather than endless debate. The feminist Ray, short for Rachel Strachey, described her as a woman who combined in a remarkable measure the gifts of wisdom, sympathy, and enthusiasm. She was one of those pioneers whose work for the women's movement was invaluable. She opposed the feminists, indeed, on some points of policy, and devoted herself mainly to improving the conditions of working women and to strengthening their position within the Labour Party. But she was one with them in her aims and ideals and in her enthusiastic support of the suffrage. For several years, Margaret was a member of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies executive, but her primary focus was on women's social and economic position, and in particular, on alleviating the conditions for the worst paid, most exploited women of all. By 1906, she had 4 children under the age of 8, who later had many tales to tell of the informal nature of their upbringing. Their parents do not seem to have believed in many of the normal Edwardian formalities of bourgeois child-rearing, and the children ran around the flat barefoot, travelled across London alone, and played riotously in the green square outside the house. Since their parents believed that religion was a personal matter, none of the children was baptized. Unlike many middle-class families, they had no bathroom, and the children were washed in a basin on the kitchen table. There were no live-in servants either, although the charwoman, Mrs. Girling, doubled as a nanny sometimes when both parents were away. There also seems to have been a certain amount of shared responsibility for childcare, with Ramsay having some or all of the children with him when Margaret was busy. Years later, their second child, Malcolm, recalled that the Labour Representation Committee's executive meetings were held in our living room. We children were not banished from the place on these occasions, provided we stayed silent. We could squat on the floor playing games, drawing and painting sketches or reading books, while the founders of Britain's Labour movement conducted their serious discussions round a table in the middle of the room. Often one or other parent was absent for days or even weeks on political business. In the run-up to the 1906 election, while Ramsay was away campaigning in Leicester, Margaret observed that Malcolm can't quite get it out of his head that his father is sleeping at the office just now, and looked in the Labour Party's headquarters in Victoria Street, then as now, for the bed. Stories of Margaret's haphazard housekeeping were legion, as were tales of her lack of attention to her personal appearance. They were very untidy, recalled one of MacDonald's secretaries. He wasn't. I think he wanted to be tidy, but she never. Other guests remembered having to clear tables of jumbles of papers, toys and hairbrushes before meetings could be held, and the MacDonald's eldest daughter, Ishbel, remarked that she had been told that the only person who could concentrate at some of these committee meetings was my mother, and we used to be crawling around under their feet, under the table, while they were sitting in committee, or we'd be crying in the corner, and my mother just went on with the business. Sometimes the informality was too much even for people who were used to it. Margaret Bonfield at one stage invited Margaret MacDonald to meet at her rooms rather than Lincoln's Inn Fields, since then I can be sure of getting your attention. What with babies and telephones and callers, it's impossible at your home. The MacDonald's flat was the obvious place at which to hold the inaugural meeting of the Women's Labour League, which was set for the 9th of March, 1906. Even then, the business was not without controversy. The original calling notice said that the organisation would operate in connection with the Labour Party. Ramsay MacDonald wrote on behalf of the NEC to object. Members did not want people to be under the misapprehension that the women would have any formal link with the party. Given that the meeting was to be held in the MacDonald's dining room, at the same table around which the LRC's executive had met for several years, it is hard to know what the breakfast conversations between the MacDonalds might have been. The women who attended this first meeting were a mix of Labour wives, trade unionists and suffrage activists. Many were members of the WSPU. Margaret was elected as president, Mary Mcpherson as secretary, and the Women's Labour League was formally founded. An interim executive was established, which included Mary MacArthur, Margaret MacDonald's friend Mary Middleton, the wife of James Middleton, the Labour Party's assistant secretary, as well as suffrage campaigners Charlotte Despard and Mary Gawthorpe. Membership was set at twopence a year for the national organisation. Local branches were allowed to set their own subscription levels, but the main aim was to make membership accessible to as wide a range of women as possible. The League decided to ignore the NEC's objections and identified its purpose as to form an organisation of women to work for independent Labour representation in connection with the Labour Party. Plans were laid to hold a conference in Leicester later that year, but first there was a meeting to launch the Central London branch in April. Speakers included Margaret Bonfield, Mary Mcpherson, Ramsay MacDonald and Keir Hardie. Sylvia Pankhurst later suggested that Hardie actually opposed the formation of the Women's Labour League, but there is little other evidence for his opposition, and most people referred to him as being positively supportive. Indeed, until the WSPU split from the Independent Labour Party, many women were comfortably members of both organisations, and the divisions between them, which are seen now with the advantage of hindsight, were not necessarily obvious to contemporaries. In June 1906, the Women's Labour League held its first conference in Leicester. It was open to all women who had joined since March, and about 150 attended, including a WSPU contingent headed by Isabella Ford and Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, who was the WSPU's treasurer and fundraiser. She moved a resolution to add a commitment to the limited suffrage option to the League's aims, but this was heavily defeated. Isabella then moved the addition of the words, and to obtain direct representation of women in Parliament and on local bodies, and this was passed. Neither Isabella Ford nor Emmeline Pethick-Lawrence remained involved with the League after this conference, though both retained a commitment to Labour itself. Isabella continued her political activism through the ILP, and Emmeline Pethick-Lawrence eventually became one of the party's first female parliamentary candidates in 1918. The Women's Labour League's original objectives had not committed it to being a specifically socialist body. But within a year, the Central London branch, to which Margaret MacDonald belonged, put down a resolution to the League's 1907 conference to add the words, "by the education of working women in the principle of socialism, to endeavour to hasten the overthrow of the present capitalist system of production." Since many trade unionists were not socialists, and indeed were actively hostile to socialism itself, this would have had the effect of distancing the League from a whole strand of the movement. Mary Mcpherson thought the resolution unhelpful, writing to Margaret MacDonald that, "as our sole object is to work with the Labour Party, so we ought to keep in step." Margaret, however, was inclined to try to get the branch to withdraw it. It had been passed in her absence, and she may well have felt irritated by it. Mary Mcpherson thought that it would be a pity if it passed, but it is always dangerous to stifle resolutions. In the end, Margaret wrote to Mary Middleton, who was soon to take over from Mary Mcpherson as secretary, that "we may as well let it go as it stands. Of course, I do not mean to stifle it, and in any case, it would be on the agenda and would be discussed by branches, and anyone could move it, even if the Central London representative did not. I dare say we shall worry through." To the extent that the proposal was withdrawn, they did, but it flagged up the problem that there was not entire agreement about what kind of political animal the Women's Labour League should be. Its leaders and members were wholly committed to the Labour Party and saw it as the working class's only hope of changing the system through democratic processes, but they also wanted to remain independent. The experience of setting up the League had shown them very clearly that male sympathy did not always translate into action, and they were strongly of the view that it should remain separate, exercising influence, organising for victory, but not being subsumed. Identifying the League too closely with any one of the different elements which composed the party would lessen that influence and would leave the League more vulnerable to the inevitable shifts of power and opinion. In 1907, Mary Mcpherson stood down as secretary, though she remained a member of the executive. The new secretary was Mary Middleton, the wife of the party's assistant secretaries and Margaret MacDonald's closest friend. Between them, these two women represented both of the main strands from which Labour in its early years was drawn. Margaret was a middle-class intellectual who had had every advantage in life. Mary was a Scottish miner's daughter whose formal education had been cut short before her teenage years. When she took over the secretary of the League, she had no administrative experience, but as Margaret said later, her eye for detail, coupled with the skill with which she dealt with difficult people, piloted the Women's Labour League through difficulties which threatened to swamp it. Outside her research, Margaret had no eye for administrative detail, and she could be intimidating, but Mary was both efficient and approachable, and she appreciated the range of women's activity in a way that perhaps more high-profile members did not. Together, Margaret MacDonald and Mary Middleton presided over the League's early years. It thrived at least in part because they nurtured rather than controlled it, and in this Mary's firm hand on the administrative tiller, efficient but not intrusive, set the tone. Many women also saw the League almost as the Labour Party's social conscience, particularly when it came to issues of concern to women. The first conference passed resolutions on, amongst other things, the inspection of dangerous trades, old age pensions, the abolition of sweated labour, the treatment of Indigenous South Africans, and free school meals, while Catherine Bruce Glazier, chairing the 1908 League conference, observed that the League could teach the men of women's needs as well as the needs of children and of the needs of the homes of the people, if they were really to be homes and not merely work kitchens and sleeping dens. The separate nature of the League meant that it could be more welcoming to a wider range of people than the party itself could. Both the party and the trade unions believed that they treated women equally, but the absence of an individual membership scheme, coupled with the very masculine nature of organised labour and the difficulties of organising women workers, meant that in practice they did not. As Lisbeth Sim noted in 1908, some old trade unionists are afraid we shall spoil the homes by taking women out to meetings. The great answer up here is women's place is in the home. Women have heard it so often that they have begun to believe it now. The question of the League's affiliation to the Labour Party was considered at the 1907 conference, and a request was sent to the party's NEC. In what may have been seen as a humorous move, the NEC had decided to send to the League's conference the one member who had voted against sending a fraternal delegate. John Hodge, who was the secretary of the Steel Smelters Union, protested vigorously in terms that will be familiar to activists everywhere. It was his only free Saturday for ages, and wouldn't somebody else be better suited? Once he got to the conference, he declared himself a supporter, although he was bound to advise them that they would not be able to affiliate unless the party's constitution was amended to allow it. Nevertheless, they duly wrote to the NEC requesting affiliation and pointing out that the League provided a channel for the expression of the special knowledge and experience of women in the party. The NEC ducked the problem by replying that it declined to comment on letters from societies not already affiliated. By 1908, this position seemed to have softened, perhaps partly because the League had worked hard in by-elections, but also perhaps partly because there was now less dual membership with the WSPU, which by then had finally cut its ties with Labour. For whatever reason, the League and the NEC agreed to recommend rule changes to the party's conference. By this time, the League's own executive had learned a thing or two about dealing with the party, and their conference was held in Hull at the same time and in the same venue as Labour's. This gave them the opportunity to network and lobby, so that by the time the resolution got to the floor of conference, there was general support for it. Unfortunately, however, the Central London branch had convinced the League to accept affiliation from women's organisations who were not eligible to affiliate to the Labour Party, which left the door open for either the WSPU or the Breakaway Women's Freedom League to affiliate at some future date. This seriously weakened the League's position with the party, so that the constitutional amendment which was actually passed represented a pale imitation of what affiliation should have been. The League would not be able to vote on questions concerning the use of the political fund, including candidates, nor participate in the election of the NEC. There was no intention of giving women a representative of their own. They could send a delegate to conference, but it would otherwise be restricted to a support role for the men. Should the League bring itself into compliance with the party's rules, i.e. cease to accept affiliations from non-Labour organisations, it would be allowed to reapply on the same basis as a trades council. This fudge was far from ideal, but it was also partially self-inflicted, and the Women's Labour League accepted it. At least it had now been recognised by the party, and it also had the freedom to develop along its own separate lines. Meanwhile, the Labour Party had done the minimum that could be required of it, and could continue to focus on the problems posed by its new status as a parliamentary organisation.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much, Nan. That was a lot of content to go through, really rich in terms of women being there at the start of the Labour Party and some key characters at play. Before we go to that content and unpack some of those themes, I'm quite interested in starting with wondering the process behind the book and the process behind unearthing these hidden histories. So what compelled you to do this?
Well, some people will have heard this story. Some years ago, we used to do a small session on LWN training, which was about the history of Labour women. And it was evident at almost all of these that people had heard of the Pankhursts, but they hadn't heard of any Labour women, or women who remained Labour, shall we say. And they had only the haziest idea about who Margaret Bonfield was and what she had done. So that's Britain's first female cabinet minister. They could not name any other Labour women other than Ellen Wilkinson until you get through to Barbara Castle. And they thought that the suffragettes were Labour and that the suffrage movement was a Labour movement. And gradually I started to get irritated by this, and banged on about it quite a lot, including in bars after LWN training, in the days when we were allowed in bars after LWN training. And eventually people started to get irritated by me and said, well, if you feel so strongly about it, why don't you do something about it? Which is what you always tell other people to do. And so I did, and the book is the result.
Excellent, and totally sort of enriching us all for that. And I suppose there, what I'm hearing is the sense to correct the record, to ensure that the whole truth is there in part of the story in terms of women's history. And I mentioned at the start as well that I'm a history teacher, and I share similar frustrations where most people believe women entered history at the start in the suffragette movement. Before then, women didn't really exist. There was nothing really to study when it came to women. Maybe Elizabeth I, but women's history is often seen through the prism of the suffragette movement as well. I suppose this allows to widen that and to understand truly what was going on at the time. Thank you for explaining the why there. Moving on, going a bit more into the process, because would you describe yourself as a historian before you started this endeavour?
No, I'm not sure I'd describe myself as a historian now. I have always read a lot of history, and I have always missed women from it, or found women only in very limited places, as you say, Elizabeth I, a handful of princesses, the occasional woman who did something remarkable, but they were always exceptions. And then underneath that, there's a sort of whole literature about, particularly in the last 20, 30 years, about the lives of working class women, but they were never seen as individual. They're always lumped together as working class women or middle class women. When you start to read contemporary records, their names are often missing. So it isn't entirely historians' fault that individual women aren't in the histories. People didn't write their names down at the time. It was just a woman said. And also I get incredibly irritated by the vision of history that always casts women as victims. So despite the fact that women did have enormous legal and social disabilities until the very late 19th century onwards, that doesn't mean that they were all victims, or that none of them had any control over their lives, or that none of them were able to achieve things. They just weren't necessarily able to achieve the things that we now value. And the things that we now value are the things that men valued when we, as you right say, when people perceive us as having entered the public space. And so, because women were not present in education prior to that, because women were not present in politics, in business, in whole swathes of areas, the things that they were doing have no value in terms of recorded history. And so, in fact, that idea is what led me to write the book that is in production now and will be out in November, fingers crossed, which goes back 100 years from this book and looks at some women who are pioneering in all kinds of political spaces, but that get left out of the story because what they did doesn't match with what our expectation of women is.
Absolutely. I think what you said there was really interesting. I hadn't really thought about that in terms of, you know, the documentation at the time. Those contemporary sources were used to dealing with, you know, such and such said this, or, you know, a speech given by this person, and the people are named very much so. So your task there seems to have been quite a challenge, really, to bring the characters to life and to have these women as agents of the time, as you were saying, not sort of passive victims, but really a part of leading the charge for women to be recognised in the party. But what that reminded me of is the story that Harriet Harman often says, which is what compelled her to write her book, which was when she was reading the books of the New Labour years, or the autobiographies and biographies that would come out, and she'd scan through the index and look for, you know, where she was, and she wasn't there at all. She was written out. So it is a case of, I suppose, you know, the challenge of writing women in, and yet we're still faced with the fact that women are in the room being written out. So on that point, do you have any advice or reflections for women of the movement now as to what you think is important so that the modern day contribution is recognised in the future?
Keep records, write your own story, because unless you do, nobody else is going to do it for you. If a woman like Harriet Harman can get written out of the history of her contemporaries while she's still alive and able to look it up for herself, then there is no hope for the rest of us unless we're proactive about making sure that what we do is lodged in the record somewhere. And we are really good as women at throwing things out. We tend not to keep political records in the way that men do. Women are much less likely to write autobiographies, and historians are less, and writers are less likely to write biographies of women. So Margaret Bonfield, first female cabinet minister, first female government minister of any description, first woman to chair the TUC, only woman at the TUC when the resolution to set the Labour Party up was passed, therefore only woman to speak in that debate, first female Privy Councillor, first. There is no modern biography of her. Now, of her contemporaries, there is, but not of her. And you can repeat that pattern with huge numbers of women who were active throughout that period, unless they are Pankhursts or very well-known suffragettes or suffragists, but mainly suffragettes, which gives us a completely distorted view of the suffrage movement as well, apart from anything else. So it is really important that we keep our own records, keep our own stories alive, tell our own stories, just get my computer in, tell our own stories and tell them to.
Oh, have we just lost Nan? Does she not get the charger in on time? Let's see.
Well, best laid plans, eh? I'll do my best to find her.
Well, I could set a little activity right now, couldn't I? Let's start writing our story.
There's been some interesting questions, Kiran, in the chat that you won't have seen so far already, including, would you say that Annie Keeney was an influence of the founding of the Labour Party? Mentions of Mo Molan. Lots of agreement that women and girls need to write their own stories. Hear, hear, sisters.
This might be a useful time actually to gather some questions for when Nan comes back, because I'm pretty sure she will. So if people would like to continue to put the questions in the chat, when Nan returns I can put them to her and I can take some myself and respond. I've seen Dorothy with her hand up. Claire, are we okay to take questions at this point and enter a discussion maybe until we wait for Nan?
Yeah, absolutely. I can see a question from Nada in the comments as well. Do you think rules and regulations that seem embedded in the Labour Party put women off from getting more involved? Could we all answer that in one word in a big yes?
Yes. Right. Let me come to Dorothy and then we'll go back to the points in the chat. Hi, Dorothy.
Hello. Yes. I mean, I've got Nan's book because I bought it at a co-op party meeting some time ago, and it just strikes me that yes, we should write our own story, but why is the Labour Party not record its own women's history? I was at a meeting a week or so ago when we were talking about the women's conference that's coming up. And I was having to explain to, these are active women there, women who, you know, are not just coming off the streets, they actually are active Labour Party women. They're saying, oh, we didn't know we had conferences. And they act like the Labour Party acts like it's just something that's been handing down to us. There's no mention that this is part of a tradition. There's no education in the Labour Party about this. It's like, well, here we are, we've done this to you. It's so frustrating. And it was also frustrating that men in the room were saying things like, oh, we can't decide anything because we don't know enough about these women. And I felt like saying, what effort have you ever made to, I mean, I didn't, but what effort have you ever made to find out about it? So I mean, I am very frustrated that women in the Labour Party have no idea that we used to have conferences. People say you can find anything out on the internet. You look up and try and find the history of Labour Party women's conferences, which I used to attend until they were stopped back in the 1990s. There is no record of them anywhere.
Thank you. And I think that's an excellent point to make about the archive and how accessible that history is, because there is a place for taking inspiration from what others in the movement have done before us. But as well as inspiration, I always feel there's a place of comfort as well to know that women have been there, they have been organising, agitating, educating constantly, and progress has been made. We might argue that progress is too slow, it might go backwards, we might be frustrated, but having that long view of women's contributions is really important. And I'd hope in a way, as we move to a more digital world because of what the pandemic has done, that we need to as well make use of archiving in this way, so people from the future can get a real flavour and hear from women themselves instead of women's voices, I suppose, passing through a conduit. So thank you for that. Oh, we do have Nan back.
I am back. I'm sorry about that. It's been one of those days.
It's absolutely fine. We were having some, as you can imagine, there's lots of people on the Zoom who have got things to say. So
Excellent.
I think I've abused Chair's position quite a lot by rattling on. So I do want to just bring in some other contributions from the chat before I take any hands. What I might do in the interests of time, Nan, is just sort of take questions in groups of 3 to put to you. So bear with me while I just see what the latest information on the chat is. So there are groups of questions, I suppose, about trying to understand the Women's Labour League positions on certain subjects at the time. So is there anything that you can reveal or know about what the Women's Labour League's position was on sort of family planning or their position to the First World War, because that split a number of other women's movements. So contemporary issues at the time where the Women's Labour League positioned itself.
In general, the Women's Labour League was opposed to the First World War, and was many of its founders have been actively opposed also to the Boer War, or South African War, and that split them much less than it split other organisations. The war split the Labour movement. Ramsay MacDonald resigned as leader in order to oppose the war publicly. Henderson and others supported the war, and Henderson became the first Labour cabinet minister as part of Lloyd George's war cabinet. But the Women's Labour League, although they continued to work with, they adopted a sort of "we are where we are" view of it. The war is bad, but given we're in it, we've got to be proactive in supporting people. So they did a lot of work around the conditions of women going into factories, the conditions of women going into various other kinds of employment. And they spent a lot of time thinking about what would happen after the war and how they should position themselves after the war. Of course, what happened after the war is that they were absorbed by the Labour Party, and their wings were clipped more than somewhat. But so the war is less of a divisive issue for the women in the party than for the men, I think it's fair to say. On issues like family planning, you have to be this is one of those things where you have to be very careful about applying things that seem obvious to us to our ancestresses, because there was some public discussion about family planning, but very little. It was not considered quite nice. And so women who wanted, for most women, there wasn't any discussion about it. And there were resolutions at the Women's Labour League, there were conferences. There were women who very strongly believed that family planning was the answer to some of the problems of poverty. There is a class element to that, so we have to be slightly careful about assuming that any discussion of things like family planning was a good idea, because very often it was used as an argument. You know, you stop poverty by preventing the poor from having children, and it's a short hop from that pre-First World War to eugenics post-First World War. And so the whole setting in which family planning and its related issues were discussed is very different from what it is now in our society, and by ours I mean in this country, where family planning has been freely available on the NHS since the 1960s. And that isn't the case around the world even now. And if you look at somewhere like the United States, they're still having discussions about whether or not it's a good thing and whether or not women should be allowed to exercise their own judgment over it. So we can't back engineer debates that we think ought to have been happening and try to behave as though they had happened. That's the mistake we make with the suffrage movement, where we try to shoehorn into it things that actually were never there.
Indeed. The history that we find is very important when trying to tell the stories of the time. There are a couple of other questions regarding women's organisation within the party. So I believe Liz and others are busy stuffing envelopes this evening, multitasking whilst listening to women's history, which is fantastic. But the question there was around women's organisation at the time, so sort of recruiting women. How did that happen? What did the Women's Labour League do around encouraging more women to join?
They recruited around the country. They recruited through the ILP, which women were involved in. They recruited through trade unions. Many trade unions did not accept women members, but some did. Many trade unions had sort of women's sections for wives. So the Railway Women's Guild was not an organisation of women who worked for the railways, because, you know, except as cleaners and things, women did not work for the railways, but they were the wives of men who worked for the railways. And so in a number of industries, there were women's organisations which were attached to it and which were fertile recruitment ground for women. They were very clear that their target audience was working class women. They did not want to be another, as they saw it, middle class women's organisation campaigning for themselves. And so they were always a mix of working class women and middle class women of very different backgrounds, like Margaret MacDonald and Mary Middleton, who couldn't really have been further apart in their origins, but came together in pursuing their objectives. They were very active on a number of fronts. They did a lot of election work. A lot of them had, because the suffrage movement had experience of election work, anybody who had experience through the suffrage movement of running elections, particularly by-elections, came and did that within the Labour movement. And to such an extent that when the party absorbed the Women's Labour League, running committee rooms and that kind of thing was something that it was considered suitable work for women. Other things less so. They campaigned on a whole range of social and industrial issues. The one that immediately springs to mind is school meals, because we're still doing it. The 1906 PLP managed to get, they didn't manage to get, there were only 29 of them, but by negotiating with the Liberals, they managed to get a school meals act through Parliament. But whereas they wanted it to be compulsory, the Liberal government made it optional. And so the Women's Labour League around the country conducted campaigns in individual local authorities to persuade them to adopt the school meals the provisions of the School Meals Act and provide free school meals, in particular breakfast. They were more worried about breakfast than they were about lunch, because children were going to school. Again, it's depressing familiar tale. The children were going to school without breakfasts, and they thought children wouldn't learn if they weren't fed, and if they were cold and hungry, and so they campaigned to get children free breakfasts, and met a lot of resistance from male councillors and active hostility in some cases. So they picked up specific issues, as I say, some of them familiar to us, others less so, more related to their times. Another huge issue was sweated labour, and what form a minimum wage should take. So there was a major debate about how a minimum wage should be developed and implemented, and both trade union women and labour women spent a lot of time campaigning for that to happen. The chainmakers strike in the Black Country that we all have heard of, I hope, was in fact a strike to get the first minimum wage implemented. So a whole range of things before we get to the international stuff, where they were opposed to militarism, opposed to imperialism, and I would say opposed to the empire, but they don't have quite the same perception of empire as we do, but they were opposed to Britain's presence and activities in most of the countries which Britain was then governing.
Something you mentioned just there, Nan, in your comments, and was very much present in the excerpts that you read as well, was Labour men's public sort of support for the women's movement, but very much a private hostility towards it, or not wanting to see it in the way that the women in the party wanted it to be. Why do you think that was?
Most men took the view that women's role was not in politics, and they wanted women to be supportive of them, obviously, but they did not want women to be active in their own interest. They were hostile to the suffrage campaign because the demand that the suffrage, both suffrage campaigns, both militant and the non-militant campaigns were making, was for a limited suffrage which would enfranchise middle-class women but not working-class women. And middle-class women took the view that working-class women would have to wait until the middle-class women had the vote, and then the middle-class women would use their access in Parliament in order to make things better for working-class women. And both working-class women and working-class men took the view of, but you could do many things now if you actually wanted to, and you don't. So why should we trust you to go into Parliament and work on our behalf? For every suffragette, this is not quite true, I'll rephrase that. For many, when you see the pictures of many middle-class women, the question that you have to ask is, who made their clothes? Probably sweated labour in cities, in the East End of London, in places like Leeds and Bradford and Manchester. Who is at home looking after their children? A working class woman, paid a pittance almost always. The McDonald's didn't have live-in servants as a matter of principle, not because they couldn't afford them, but because they thought that live-in servants, that families should look after their own children, not that they necessarily did, but they had a principled objection to the employment of women on poverty wages. And so the working class men and left-wing middle class men were quite hostile to women who they felt were not going to work in the interests of the working classes. A very strong sense of class, much stronger than there is now, and a much clearer definition as to who was in what class. There's a much, a very detailed understanding of where you belonged in the pecking order. And plus, we look back now and the legal and social position that women have in society now, we just take for granted. We just assume that that's what we have. And in fact, it's what we've had to fight for all the way through. And in the early 20th century, women did not have many of the rights that we just now accept as that's where we are. So women were not defined as persons until the 1920s, legally. Women only had women only had the right to their own money in the latter part of the 19th century. If the Married Women's Property Act hadn't happened, the suffrage movement would not have happened, because women had no economic independence once they were married. And so we just take things for granted. But in fact, those women were not in many senses as free as we are now. They were second-class citizens. They were very definitely second-class citizens. Not only could they not vote, they, needed their husband's permission to do all kinds of things within the living memory of me and other women on this call. Women needed their husbands or a male countersignature to take out loans and mortgages. My mother was the breadwinner in our house, but she had to have my father's countersignature when she got a mortgage to buy a house. So we just assume that all the things we can do, we have always been able to do, and that therefore we have always had a measure of equality. Women at that time had hardly any equality, and men did not see why they should. Plus, the people who have the power never actually volunteer to give it away, do they?
Indeed. Okay, well, I mean, I could talk to you about this for hours on end, but we are coming to a close for this evening's event. Before we do, though, I just want to take the last question from Lorna in the chat, which is that the passage that you read seemed to be about recording priorities for that organisation at the time. So, Nan, what are your views about what the current priorities that Labour Women's Network should be campaigning for, fighting for today?
Well, Labour Women's Network is an organisation of women campaigning for women's power and agency in the Labour Party. And so within that sort of definition, I think that the party has come quite a long way from where it was in 1906, but I don't think it's managed to come quite far enough. And I don't think it has dealt well with some of the issues which have arisen since that time. I think it is better at the outward facing stuff. I think it is not good at the inward facing stuff. I think there are things like an independent complaints procedure from first contact to outcome that the party has resisted and resisted and resisted, that we have been banging on about for I don't know how long. that may finally come to fruition, but that is as slow. That has been as slow as getting the party before the First World War to recognise that, you know, women might have a role to play in it that wasn't just about how the men wanted to define it. I think that there are still a lot of issues around representation at all levels, and I include Parliament in that. I don't think that the party has yet changed its culture sufficiently to select women for powerful positions because they are the right person for the job. Some people would, some people would not. I think we are not yet in a position where women have real power within the party. I think we have women in positions, but I think we don't necessarily, I think we shouldn't confuse position with power. And it's quite easy to do that. We're often fobbed off with positions when what we really want is power. I don't really care what the titles of things are. I want to know what power they have. So I think there are a whole range of issues around that. I think also that in terms of the wider women's movement and its relation to politics, I think we still have the problem that people, and I say this as somebody who trains women, we still have a problem of people want to fix women instead of fixing the system. Because it's easier to tell women they aren't good enough, or that they need to change something about themselves, or that they need to be something different, than it is to fix, and I choose my words with care, an institutionally sexist system. And so we are, and women fall for this over and over and over again. So LWN training is about dragging out of you what is already in there and getting you to express it in a different way. As those of you who've done our training will know. What we are not about is saying, if only you tried a bit harder, if only you were a bit different. And I still see people offering training to women that basically is saying exactly that. And it irritates the hell out of me. Nobody ever says to men, you're not quite ready for this yet, but if you do this, you find out about this, you do that, you smarten yourself up a bit, you need to understand the political process. Men just go in and get on with it. I would argue it would be better if all politicians had to be trained. And, if you want to run a country or a council or anything else, go and find out how to do it first. But that's not where we are.
Well, thank you ever so much. Those concluding remarks, absolutely. The ideas of power, not position, and going back to the reading, I suppose if we were going to move the motion to destroy anything, it would be moving the motion to bring down the institutionally sexist cultures that still remain. I'm sure we can all get behind that. So thank you. Just a final couple of remarks before we do draw to an end. If you haven't bought Nan's book that we discussed, please do. It's fascinating. You can hear how the stories of Mary and Margaret develop over the years there. As Nan mentioned, she does have another book coming out in autumn with an absolutely exceptionally fantastic title, I believe, of Uncontrollable Women, the Radicals, Reformers and Revolutionaries. And I think the challenge and the call to all of us, which was pick up that pen or phone or keypad and start writing, start documenting our stories, your stories, sisters around us. you know, find your voice, use it, amplify others, because we will be written out unless we absolutely write ourselves in. So thank you for that really, really intriguing, fascinating exploration of Labour women's history in Women's History Month. Claire has put details in the chat. If you're not a LWN member, please do join us. Please do support us so that we can continue events like this and the training that we do. Do keep the conversation going via social media, uncover those hidden histories that remain, that are there in the movement, and I think that will inspire us to all go forward together. So thank you ever so much. Lovely to be here, and enjoy the weekend when it comes.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your weekend.